Welcome to On English Speak Through Stories of Rumpole and the Hanging Judge. The echoes of an unresolved past reverberate as Horace Rumpole meets Lord Justice Trust, a formidable hanging judge. Their paths cross once more, reigniting old tensions and stirring memories of a case that haunts Rumpole deeply. Prescott, now at the twilight of his career, seeks Rumpole's company for lunch, exuding an unsettling confidence that reveals layers of complexity beneath his authoritative exterior. Join Tony Walker on the Classic Detective Stories podcast for John Mortimer's story, Rumpole and the Hanging Judge. Rumpole and the Hanging Judge by John Mortimer. It was said of Mr. Justice Tricect that he always ordered muffins for tea at his club after passing a death sentence. Sir Kenmore Torres has now happily dropped off the twig, but I don't believe death to be a particularly good excuse, and I'm prepared to speak as much ill of the old sweetheart now as I was when he sat upon the bench, taking snuff, sneezing into a silk bandana, grunting at junior counsel, and handing out intolerable sentences. When I read his obituary in the Times, I couldn't restrain a moderate feeling of contentment at the death of one who, as I told my wife Hilda, she who must be obeyed, was widely regarded in the legal profession as Judge Jeffreys without the jokes. Not that frightful fellow was without jokes entirely, he just didn't make much use of them in court. As an after-dinner speaker at sheriff's gatherings, anecdotes would send the ladies scurrying from the room in hot flushes as he embarked yet again on the story of the bestiality case he tried in trio or the hilarious rape he heard in devices to those of a forgiving nature. Kenmore Prescott might then have been described as of a jovial, even Arabian disposition, but the atmosphere in his court was about as cheerful as a baby's funeral. All the same, his outrageous rudeness did occasionally achieve a sort of sharpness which might have been called wit by sympathetic observers. I was not, as you may have gathered, to be numbered among these tolerant persons, and that was not only because of the outrageous treatment I received at his hands. I have had more stand-up rows, misdirections, interruptions, and deterrent sentences from Old Fun than I have had bottles of Pomp Plunk. But because he was, as you will no doubt recall, the man who hanged Martin Duchamp. I suppose to anyone under 40, the name of Marty Duchamp won't mean anything in particular, but in the remote days when we still believed in death as a short, sharp measure of penal reform, young Duchamp was, for a brief moment in our legal history, a sort of star with his photograph on the front page of the News of the World. His slow but inevitable progress towards the scaffold was watched by the populace over their Sunday breakfasts with a sort of tremulous second-hand excitement, which was the next best thing to a first-floor window in Newgate Street during the working life of Jack Ketch. Marty, although he had, as I say, attained executable years, was said to have the mental age of a child of 10. He had a girlfriend, a mistress indeed, called Louise Neatley, who, from the photographs provided, was not only somewhat under par in the glamour department but had that curious expression, that mixture of resentment, docility, and ill-tempered resignation which seems, in a curious way, to be the hallmark of the murderers. On the night in question, Marty and Louise had been heard quarreling in a coffee bar near the street in Piney where they both lived. Later, they admittedly went for a walk together in Wimbledon Common. Marty's evidence was that they had had another quarrel, and Louise ran off and left him. He said he sat on a seat for a long while smoking and thinking things over, and then got up and started vaguely looking for her. He found her legs without any particular difficulty sticking out of a clump of laurels. When he uncovered the rest of Louise, it was clear that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. He knelt beside her to see if she was still breathing, and that is how, he told the police, after a good many lies and denials that he had never been near the body, Louise's blood came to be on his shirt cuffs and trousers. It was the sort of case, after all, which might have been lost by the most fearless advocate before the fairest tribunal. Martin was not defended, unfortunately, by Horace Rumpole, then enjoying a certain well-deserved notoriety as the victor of the Penn Bungalow murders. His counsel, a youngish QC used to appearing for such respected bodies as building societies and banks, was unnerved at the frosty reception given to those whose client for the day is an alleged teenage murderer and rapist. Marty Duchamp was found guilty. His father organized a petition with 3,000 signatures, but the Home Secretary of the day, a worried ex-headmaster of the labor persuasion, saw no reason why the law should not take its course. Martin Muschamp vanished from this earth and from the front pages for a while. 5 years later, a man named Heather was picked up for a number of similar crimes and confessed to having found Louise wandering alone on Wimbledon Common and raped and killed her. The description he gave of his victim was convincing. Influential persons wrote letters to the Times, a television film was made on the subject, and there was an inquiry after which Marty Duchamp, buried within the prison walls, failed to hear the good news that his innocence had been established. The inquiry was at pains to point out that Mr. Justice Trust had conducted the trial with perfect impartiality on the evidence as it was known to him at the time, and that no blame attached to him whatsoever. The abolition of the death penalty and the fact that murder trials are now conducted in what old Prescott once described in one of his inimitable after-dinner speeches as a sort of holiday atmosphere has taken most of the pep out of detective stories. The shadow of 10 years in the nick began to fall across the sour face of Quinton, later wrote, is not the sort of line that appeals greatly to your average lady writer of Hunt. Such authoresses prefer the drama of the noose. It has also meant a huge drop in box office takings and a falling away of audiences, which I have noticed at my more recent murder trials. In fact, the case I did at Grumble Assizes was one of the last murders of the old hanging darling ever tried in this world. God help us if he is now performing some judicial function. On the other hand, it took place in an almost empty courtroom. There was only one man in the public gallery, but he was the most conscientious attender. He was in his place dead at 10 o'clock each morning and stayed until Trust rose at 4:30, when he would stand, bow smartly to the judge, and walk away alone. He was a gaunt, thin-faced man with red hair going gray, and he wore, in spite of the courtroom's oppressive central heating, a frayed overcoat and a checked woolen muffler. Always, he had pale blue eyes, and they were fixed throughout the proceedings on the aging and frequently scowling face of Mr. Justice Trust. We were unable, I'm afraid, to put on a particularly fascinating show for our dedicated fan. The murder was a result of a fight outside a pub at closing time. It involved the use of some rather choice language, a broken Guinness bottle, and, like the vast majority of killings, was remote from any plot used by a lady writer of Hoyden, its being more accurately described as a rather dreary case of common assault with disastrous consequences. Even the prisoner seemed unable to show a great deal of interest in the events as they unfolded. The jury sat in sick silence. The bespectacled young prosecutor presented the case with all the riveting aura of a lecturer taking an evening class on double-entry bookkeeping. It didn't seem the sort of show that could keep even our solitary spectator glued to his seat. Such entertainment value as existed was provided by his lordship. He went through the whole repertoire of judicial tricks, and gave us all the golden oldies of judicial behavior he formed on the jury members of the jury. You and I may have to spend a few days together now. If any of you require a short break for any reason, you won't hesitate to tell me, will you? He treated prosecuting and defense counsel with impartial contempt. When the prosecutor went carefully through a witness's statement, he said, with a small amount of reasonable preparation, Mr. R., we could have got through that witness in half the time. When I was doing moderately well with my cross-examination, he'd say, "It's hardly in your client's best interest to labor every detail, is it, Mr. Rump?" If the prosecution made a good point, he'd find it was an excellent moment to adjourn so that the jury could brood on it during lunch. If yours truly scored a minor hit, he would do his best to minimize its effect with a series of laborious and carefully worded questions, ending with a triumphant glare at the jury and a long time spent recording it in his notebook. Around the third day of the trial, I was cross-examining a copper in a reasonably uncontroversial, duster fashion and venturing to suggest that some of my client's less well-chosen phrases, so I made up my mind to bash the mick on the head and looked around for a bottle, was one of them, had, in fact, been composed at the station by officers with some talent for stage dialogue and a burning zeal to secure a conviction. Mr. Ample, there was a noise from the bench like the rumbling eruption of some almost extinct volcano. Are you seriously suggesting that this young officer is seeking to mislead this jury at this point? Something snapped inside Rumpole. I had had enough of the old darling's interruptions, and if I were going down, I might as well sink with all guns blazing. I really can't see what being young has to do with it. My lord, I bowed with exaggerated politeness, I never heard there was an age limit for inventing a prisoner's verbals. It may well be something that comes fairly early on in the course of police training in the fair city of Grumble. There wasn't even a titter from the 12 honest citizens in the jury box. Indeed, they looked at me rather as a bench of cannons might look at a member of the congregation who has just blown an almighty raspberry at the bishop during the course of his Kenton address. I was surprised, however, to receive no further rebuke from the bench. Indeed, I thought I saw about the long thin line of the judge's mouth something which might even be interpreted as a smile. I continued to go through the formalities of challenging the police notebook, and as I did so, the usher handed me a note from the judge. I glanced at it, not sure if it was to announce my immediate committal for contempt or to tell me that my flies were undone. "Dear Omar," I read in his lordship's meticulous handwriting, "if you're free during the adjournment, perhaps you'd care to lunch at the lodgings." "He was sat beside me in the cinema, sir," said this girl complainant in the indecent assault. "And he put his hand up my skirt." "Very well," said the old recorder with his eye on the clock, "I suggest we leave it there until 5 o'clock. I gave a token smile. TRC's story was not a new one. I had been looking forward to a restful lunch in the Grimble Arms at a pub opposite the back entrance of the LW Courts and to a solitary pint of draft Guinness and a portion of steak and kidney pie. Instead, I was whisked with his scarlet lordship and police outriders to a Victorian manor house in the suburbs, that gloomy lodging where Trust J served his own particular sentence of imprisonment. He made a stab at a chop, dropped gravy on his chin, and then looked at me and said after a long silence, "I like the way you're doing this case, Rump. You understand what it's all about, courage." I felt for the claret. It was a tribute I'd never sought or expected. You need courage to do both our jobs. Courage to take a view of a case and to stick to it, even though it might be mistaken. Mistakes can usually be put right. Trusat speared a potato. Nowadays, perhaps it wasn't possible, though. "In some of your old cases," I said with as much malignity as I could manage. "You're thinking of Muschamp." He was ahead of me. He seemed smaller without his wig on and much older. His head was bald and wrinkled, but his eye was bright and quick, like a bird's. I'd feel exactly the same about the Muschamp case today. The idea of the girl wandering off and getting killed by someone else, it was an impossible coincidence. apparently not impossible. I felt that the judge was asking me for something. Possibly approval. Of course, the death penalty made that sort of mistake a little hard to put right. The death penalty. People talk a lot about the death penalty. They don't remember that hard cases make bad laws. Nothing wrong with the death penalty was needed facing up to, of course, but for us, it was simply part of the job. Wasn't it part of your job? I was an advocate and able to avoid final responsibility, not a part that gave me any particular satisfaction. Of course, you may have heard a ridiculous story about muffins quite without foundation. You haven't been able to get muffins at the Army and Navy Club since before the war. You're a gardener? Rumpole? I'm afraid not. Indeed, our alleged mansion flat in the Gloucester Road provided little scope for the harbour's boarder. I was still a little surprised at the development of his lordship's argument. I'm a rose man myself, he told me. Of course, it's been a little difficult to get around to all the pruning since my wife died. Anyway, he returned to the subject like a man with a pimple he can't resist touching. It was never my decision. The jury found Muschamp guilty. But of course, you directed the jury? Oh yes, he admitted. You told them he'd frequently broken the law by having an affair with a girl under 16. I thought that showed a certain ruthlessness. But didn't it make it somewhat unlikely that he'd go to the trouble of raping her? I asked the question, but I still wasn't entirely sure what was happening. Had the old darling sought me out because he wanted to be questioned by someone who has, I must in all modesty admit, something of a talent for cross-examination? She wouldn't agree to his rogering her that night. The judge explained, so they'd had a quarrel. You make it all sound extremely simple. I like to keep things simple in the law, he smiled. Then I find juries understand them better. So, why did he kill her? So that she wouldn't give evidence against him? Of course, a perfectly simple explanation. The only trouble with it was that it turned out to be wrong anyway. And too soon his lordship lifted his table napkin and wiped the spot of gravy off his chin. It was the jury's decision. As I said, I remembered the newspaper reports and the helpless anger I'd felt when reading them. Horace could have told the jury at least 3 times in his summing up that they might find it hard to believe the defendant's evidence. Now he had raised the subject, and I had no objection to reminding him what he said. Champ lied outrageously to the police. He defended himself at first. He told them he'd never been on the common with the girl at all. I was perfectly entitled to point that out, surely. Alone at the lunch table in the dark, chilly dining room with the port between us and the clock ticking on the mantelpiece, we seemed to be undergoing an extraordinary change of roles. I had been appointed the judge by whom Kenmore Prescott was apparently anxious, after all these years, to be acquitted. I said nothing, but I pulled the watch out of my pocket. Judgment was no part of my profession. Yes, we must get back, he agreed. I thought, Ramp, you might care to see this. He went over to a sideboard then and found the silver-framed photograph he must always have taken on circuit with him. He showed me a rose garden by a spry house and 2 schoolgirls, rather plain children in cotton frocks and cardigans, frowning at the camera. The Mrs. Sam Kerr is fling well, don't you think? Oh, and that's 2 of the grandchildren. What I was being shown was the evidence in mitigation, the fact that he grew roses and could breed a 3rd generation of female Truscotts with cold eyes and thin, lidless mouths that might someday snap in some irreversible judgment, was apparently to be put to his credit. I took careful note of all he said, but the least sentence I thought I could pass on him was silence, so I said nothing, or not at any rate until we were settled in embarrassing proximity in the back of the creaking damper. "There's a man in court who comes to listen to every moment of our trial. He pays the most extraordinary attention to you, Judge. Have you any idea who he is?" "No, really." Trust looked out of the window, uninterested. I hadn't noticed. I asked that, like all good questions, because I already knew the answer. I had discovered who our dedicated visitor was because I had heard an usher whisper a name, and I could just remember the distraught and pathetic face of a man hopelessly holding up a petition with 3,000 signatures, pictures on the front page of the News of the World. Our devoted spectator was there when we got back to court, and he listened intently while Trust J, reverting to form, showed no sign whatever of having shared a chop and a glass of claret with me or having urged his case before me as an unlikely tribunal. I was not greatly disturbed by Frightful Fun that afternoon. He had, to be sure, his own appalling fate and apparently went on circuit forever. Accompanied by an accusing figure, a man haunting him and reminding him, in every subsequent case, of an old, irreversible mistake. The justice of it, I had to admit, pleased me, and in this implacable pursuit I did feel that a judicial crime was in some way absolved. Mr. Justice Trusat was like a hunted man, a criminal on the run, and his elderly, wrinkled head shrank into his stiff collar and IR-trimmed gown like the retracting head of a tortoise. For a moment, I felt almost ready to forgive him. There was, of course, a great deal to forgive. The old darling not only interrupted my speech to the jury 3 times, but he also dozed ostentatiously during the moving bits of my oration. And when it came to the summing up, he was ever ready, with the boot. A great deal of his elegant footwork was done by gesture and tone of voice. Of course, the defendant says, members of the jury, that he was quite unaware of the fact that he had picked up any sort of weapon, and you may even believe him, hopeless rolling of the eyes towards heaven and the strong implication that if you believe that, you must be off your chump. Much of the defense case was put with a weary sigh of, perhaps you can accept that, members of the jury. It's entirely a matter for you. After they had heard the evidence of that very decent young police officer, you may remember, the one with the small mustache, the outcome was no longer in doubt, nor was it delayed for very long. After I had said goodbye to my client, I went to drown the memories of a case which could never be rated among the Rumpole triumphs. In the dark and stuffy little bar, with its hissing coal fires and comforting sawdust-covered floor, where I had been denied my usual luncheon, I ordered a large rum and lit up a small cigar. And I was sitting with the golden spirit flooding into my veins, and the familiar ash falling gently onto the waistcoat when our constant audience came into the bar, stood near me, and ordered a half of mild ale. I saw how large his hands were and that his exposed wrists were red and bony. "You're right, Mr. Muschamp," I said, my tongue a little loosened by a second double. "He's an unmitigated bastard." "Why, sir, who would you be talking about?" The man's voice was so gentle I thought he was making an Irishman's joke. "Why, Mr. Justice Frightful Fentrouser, of course. Don't you always watch him in court?" "Sure, I always watch him. He's a fine man, a just man. I like to see him when he's working in London, and as I have a married sister up in Grumble, I take the opportunity to follow him. I find it a legal education. There's not a judge sitting with a finer sense of fair play. Now admit it, your man was as guilty as hell now, wasn't he, Mr. Ramp? Maybe he was, but your son, I don't blame him for that, not for 1 minute." Mr. Duchamp had not hesitated, and his voice remained gentle as ever. "You don't?" I choked incredulously on a recently reordered rum. Now explain that to me, he explained. Oh yes, I behaved foolishly. Once I got up in his court and I shouted at him about Marty. He had me into his room, and he explained that they'd all done their best for my boy on the facts as they knew them. It wasn't the law that was at fault, he said, and he only had his job to do. Well, you can't blame the doctor if the patient has an accident at work, can you, Mr. Rum? Perhaps not, but hard cases make bad laws. Explain that to me, Mr. Ramp, and then Mr. Duchamp spoke with a tolerant smile. I'm in favor of hanging myself, it's what they need, some of these young thugs. Do you mean to tell me, I emptied my glass before trying to catch the drift of the evidence, that you haunt old Truscott's court because you have such an enormous admiration for him? Oh yes, it's a pleasure to me to see such a fair man in action. You admire him too, don't you, Mr. Rampo? If you're honest about it, admire him? No. If I'm honest about it, no. Ah, come now. Mr. Muschamp took a delicate sip from the edge of his beer mug. I'm sure you do, otherwise you wouldn't have quarreled with him so nicely. I went back to the station hotel, all the discomforts of all-night musical plumbing, deaf waiters, and firewood in the mattresses, and soaked myself for a long time in a hot bath before catching a train back to London and She Who Must Be Obeyed. I wanted to be made clean of the memories of that extraordinary encounter. But what was it exactly that I was anxious to forget? Was it the humility that could pardon greater wrongs than I had ever suffered? Or was it man's endless capacity to respect cruelty and injustice? Was it perhaps a revulsion at that forgiveness which is almost an insult to compassion? I turned the hot water tap with my great toe and did my best to wash away the grime of Grimble. If you like that story, consider supporting me as a patron. That way, you help me make more stories for you and get access to a patron-only library of stories, lots more hours for you to listen to. So that was Rumpole and the Hanging Judge by John Mortimer. There's quite a lot to say about it. First of all, I want to apologize for any pleasant bonging you may hear in the background. Sheila's practicing with her singing bowls downstairs. There's also some kind of odd growling as the dogs wrestle each other and play fight. Then, the scrap man's not scrapping outside, but there are some crows on the roof, and people seem to be incessantly driving heavy vehicles and loud motorbikes outside the house. So, you may ask yourself, why don't you just not record? Well, there is no time when I'm not asleep, this just suits me, so there we are. It won't distract anyway. So, let's say something about this story. This story was published in 1992 and is otherwise uncollected. If you look, I put a link in the show notes. There's a collection of uncollected, that's a weird thing to say, otherwise uncollected are post stories by a guy named David McKinley who created them. This is one of them. It was published in the TV detective television Detectives Omnibus, of which I've got a copy that I found in a second-hand shop here. It's got all sorts of stories in it, but otherwise, apparently, this wasn't published elsewhere. So, this came out in 1992. It may even be that this book I've got is worth a fortune, but perhaps it isn't. So, let's say the first thing. If there is a copyright issue about this and the copyright owner isn't happy that I'm doing this as an homage to the work, then I'll remove it. Just let me know, and I'll remove it. The next thing to say is we have left the cozy world of cozy detective fiction, haven't we? You can notice that, even though it's not particularly graphic, this story, as opposed to many of the things that we see on our screens, CA screens and TV screens, it depends on how you watch them, on your laptop, your tablet, or whatever, your phone. I have never really known young people to watch films on their phones, but I mean, to me, I can't see them. They're a mystery to me, young people, really. So, we just let them get on with it. So, yeah, we've left it, haven't we? We have the first mention. This is the second year of the Classic Detective Story podcast. This will be episode 3 of season 2, and this is the first time we've had the crime of rape, which I think is a modern crime. We don't find it in the classic golden oldies. I mean, there may be 1 or 2 of them, but I haven't come across them. Mostly, they're murders, which in some way seem to be less offensive, which somebody can debate, not me, or thefts, embezzlements, or some kind of fraud, which all seem fairly tame. And then we get this. When I read it, I thought, oh, will there be some pearl clutching? Will there be some coffee spluttering? But we've got to go with it, and then the next thing was, there was a reference to sexual intercourse. Again, we don't get that in the old cozies. So, we've moved into a more modern world, but not quite the graphic world of modern crime fiction. Not all crime fiction is as graphic as that. As I said, I had the great privilege, and I've said this before. I keep boasting about it, of interviewing Peter James, the crime writer. One of the biggest crime writers, certainly British. British is probably the biggest British crime writer. You can debate that as well, and he said to me that he doesn't do anything graphic, he doesn't do anything, perverse, even though it may attract an audience, which is weird. But I think, that leads to the themes of this story, doesn't it? I'm going to talk about John Mortimer's biography in a minute. There's not much to say about the publication details of this story other than what I've said. But, and he talks about how, people would come to the hanging judge's trials as a form of entertainment. And when there were public, I think it's Jack Ketch, isn't it? He was a famous public, executioner. And people would come to watch the public execution. So, this, what we might consider tasteless, excitement that's generated by judicial death is not new. It's gone back a long time. People, I don't know, people talk about the human creature's ability for great goodness and great wickedness, and there's a lot more of the great wickedness apparent these days. Maybe it always was. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't great goodness, it's just that the wickedness and the vices of people are, more apparent, it seems to me anyway. Let's move on from that. Let's talk a little bit about John Mortimer himself now. John Mortimer, came from a very privileged background in. You may not, if you're not British, you won't realize some of the things I'm saying indicate that he came from a privileged background, and that has a bearing on his political views, which is why I mention it. So, he was born in 1923 in Hampstead in London. He received his early education at the Dragon School in Oxford, followed by Harrow School. He completed his studies at Brasenose College, Oxford, where he pursued a degree in law. So these are all markers of the British elite. Mortimer was raised in Turville, Oxfordshire, which is a beautiful little village, with a hill and a windmill on it, and you can walk up to the windmill. If you ever go, there's a pub there called the Dun Bull. Now, my stepfather trained as a jeweler in, Marlow in Oxfordshire, or is it in Berkshire? I think it's in Oxfordshire. No, it's not in Oxfordshire. Marlow, anyway, somebody's going to, or maybe even Buckinghamshire, 'cause they all come together there. But they used to go drinking in the Dun Bull in Turville. I was last there several years ago, and I walked up the hill too, and Sheila wouldn't walk up the hill with me, so I took some photos from the top. But it's a beautiful, beautiful village in the Chilterns. Anyway, he was called so during the, interestingly, his father, he was raised in Turville, and his father was a blind barrister, which significantly influenced more of his own life and writing. During the Second World War, he served in the Royal Air Force in the Crown Film Unit. After his education, after the war was finished, he was called to the bar and began a career as a barrister. So I've said this before when we talk about this, the legal system in England. Is that there are two kinds of lawyer, if you like. One is the solicitor, who prepares and does all the hard work and does all the preparations and the working things out. And then the barrister is the advocate, the showman, almost like an actor, and this comes very much out in Rumpole stories. So he practiced, he wrote about what he knew. He was a barrister. Rumpole is a barrister, so the world he's portraying to you is real, you know. It may be exaggerated in parts for comic effect, but I think Mortimer is really insightful anyway. He wrote, initially he struggled to establish his legal practice but found success in divorce law and later in criminal defense. I've got a friend who's a criminal, barrister, and there's not a lot of money in it at the level of just going around the local courts defending people who, as we saw in the story, hit people with bottles and kill them, by mistake almost, you know. Just a kind of, mundane, banal, vicious murdering. This murdering isn't a word, of course. So, anyway, he wrote as well. Mortimer wrote, and he wrote A Voyage Round My Father, which explored his complex relationship with his father. His first novel was Charade, published in 1947. In his legal work, he became prominent as a defender in free speech and civil rights, achieving recognition as Queen's Counsel. So, yeah, as silk, as they call them. When you can be a barrister and then you get elevated, it's a King's Counsel these days, or KC, but for nearly everybody's. Most of everybody living's life, it was the QC. And his main character is someone like him, a working barrister, Horace Rumpole, and he first appeared in a play on the BBC, Play for Today, and then he was so popular that Mortimer wrote fiction stories about him, so the first Rumpole story, Rumpole of the Bough, was published in 1978. He says the character was inspired by his father, Clifford, the blind barrister, and rapidly became beloved. So, you know, he sits there, and he smokes his cigars, and he drinks his, brandy, was it rum? Can't remember. Brandy, I think, in these, old and slightly grubby dark pubs, and eats steak and kidney pudding. My stepfather loved Rumpole. He was, it was very interesting because my stepfather was very conservative, and this is definitely his kind of thing. But Mortimer was the opposite. Mortimer was Mortimer was a liberal. Yeah, I don't want to stray too far into the culture wars here. So anyway, he wrote a number of other, types of novels and wrote his autobiography, Clinging to the Wreckage, published in 82 to 1982. He had a tumultuous first marriage, and then a later marriage to Penelope Gollop, with whom he had 2 daughters. And the older he became, the more determined he was to cudgel his mind for any idea that might amuse a reader. So he's looking to amuse you as he's writing, while continuing to champion the causes for which he cared, the Howard League for Penal Reform. So clearly in this story, he's not much of a fan of the death penalty, despite, the old, Judge Trusat, his lordship, the Lord Trusat. Yeah, you can become, I'm not too up on lords, but, bishops are lords. So in the House of Lords is bishops, the lords spiritual sit along with the aristocrats. I mean, they've cleared out a lot of them now, with the barons, the earls, and people like that who were lords because of their titles. But many of the senior judges become lords as well, so we see that, John Mortimer was a passionate believer in free speech, and you should be able to say what you want. He ended up defending a lot of pornography cases. Particularly, he defended, when the director of public prosecutions was trying to ban Inside Linda, 1973, for obscenity. He, defended it, and he was really credited, Mortimer, by that foundational case, opening the doors to all sorts of pornography being published. But, I mean, that was his thing, you know. People say that, he, with his high-mindedness, sometimes took off his glasses to shield himself from the trash that he was defending. Again, all still very live issues, aren't they? All this free speech stuff. And I think it's interesting, whereas, the voices that speak for free speech now tend to be on the conservative side. Certainly, in the 60s and 70s, free speech was on the, liberal side, really. And that's an interesting switch around, isn't it? I have no in-depth comments to make about why or how or what that might mean, but I just noted it. It says, politically, his faith in liberal socialism wavered towards the end of his life. He came from a one-member communist cohort at Harrow School, so there's probably not many communists at that very prestigious and expensive school. He went on to support a post-war Labour Party. And I've spoken about that, the changes brought in by the Labour Party coming in, the socialist government coming in after the Second World War in the UK. It actually caused some comments. You know, people tell me, stop that, and stuff like that. Somebody had a banner though, so where were we? And then when Tony Blair came in, who moved the Labour Party potentially, I think you could argue, to the right and became more center, more conservative, particularly pursuing the war in Iraq. He kind of fell out with the Labour Party in a way and ended up voting Liberal Democrat. So, there was an unauthorized biography of him. Man, he did his own, clinging to the wreckage, but somebody wrote A Voyage Around John Mortimer. That was an authorized one. Valerie Grove wrote that in 2007. So, if you see A Voyage Around My Father, that was his biography for his father. The Blind Barrister. What a tremendous. And he died when he was 86 in 2009 near Henley-on-Thames, not very far from Turville really, still in Oxfordshire. What a fantastic and interesting life. If you go on the internet, as I was, there's, a sort of. It's not really, a death notice thing, but it's by Peter Hitchens again, who's a famously. He's dead as well, conservative commentator. I've got one of his books here. No, it's his brother, Christopher Hitchens. I mixed them up. Anyway, I mean, that's just. Probably somebody just spat their coffee out at that point. But, there we are. I'm only human, as you can tell. So. And Hitchens didn't like his politics. Didn't like Mortimer's politics, but he did like Rumpole of the Bailey. So, probably a bit like my dad in that he didn't like Mortimer's politics, but he liked his stories, this courtroom drama. There's something to be said about the history of courtroom dramas because, it's like a subgenre of detective fiction. In a sense, we know the crime has been committed. With some courtroom dramas, we don't know, there is still a mystery to be solved in that, was the person guilty? And I think in many courtroom dramas, that's the key thing. So that is the, detection element, or the suspense element, or the mystery element, that we are going to find out. But I think in this case particularly, what really elevates the story, and let's say something about courtroom dramas first. So we have, of course, John Grisham, Scott Turow, notable for crafting complex narratives that highlight the dilemmas faced by individuals entangled in criminal cases. Their work draws on earlier literary traditions, particularly the Gothic, where law and morality often collided with chaos and disorder. Well, you will know, and I don't think it's my thought, that detective fiction descends from Gothic via Edgar Allan Poe, So we have the 18th century Gothic, and then in the, early to middle part of the 19th century, we have Poe, who's a fantastically important figure in the development of genre fiction of all kinds. And we can talk about the critics who would say all their interest lies in his spectacle, in creating cheap emotions such as fear, such as, horror, such as lust, I suppose. And they use violence and titillation and all sorts of stuff. So their critics said that they are, worthless because of that, because it's just spectacle. But their defenders, and they themselves, used. There was a guy, Edmund Burke, who wrote a conservative. Again, I wrote I don't know why I keep coming back to this left and right thing. It actually doesn't massively interest me, but I seem to be saying a lot about it today. So, he wrote about, the sublime, the feeling of the sublime when we are confronted with awe, like a huge mountain or a glacier or something like that. And he talked about how the Gothic writers would create this feeling of the sublime. One of the ways you do it is through horror, shock, and assaulting the senses with strong emotions. So, that was their defense. Their critics would say it was worthless, and they themselves said it was to evoke the sublime, and sell some books as well. But, so yeah. Grisham and Scott Turow just said that as an aside, because their work draws on this Gothic tradition. Very often, the Gothic stories had to do with legacies, wills, and legal issues, about rights being wronged and wrongs being righted. The origins of courtroom drama in fiction as a subgenre of detective fiction can be traced to the 19th century. Poe has detectives, but the courtroom aspect, there's a French writer called Émile Gaboriau, often regarded as a foundational figure in detective fiction. And, of course, Conan Doyle introduced legal themes, such as in The Adventure of the Sussex Vampire, which I've actually done on the Detective Channel if you want to go and listen to it. And the courtroom dramas, you can also say historically they coincide with increasing public interest in the legal system during the 19th and 20th centuries, I think, as we've said about the public executions. The public's always been interested in the spectacle of the legal system. They might not be interested in the minutiae of environmental arguments back and forth, or, they are interested in divorce cases if there's a bit of violence in them, if there's a bit of, muck, really. But the public, perhaps, we might say, doesn't have very sophisticated and developed tastes. But I think, they've been interested in, shocking courtroom fiction for a long time. Courtroom fiction, courtroom details for a long time, and we have Agatha Christie's witness for the prosecution, which we've done. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, which we haven't done. And so why I think this is interesting, why I wanted to do this story for 2 reasons, 3 reasons. 1, it's a good story. It's really well written. Second, it, is a different kind. It's a more modern kind of story than we've done. Thirdly, it's the first courtroom. There have been stories which have mentioned courtrooms in them before, but this is the first courtroom story per se that we've done. And I think when, I've talked about the critiques of Gothic and genre fiction, its children, the children of the Gothic, crime, horror, porn, they are the children of Gothic fiction, those genres. And they've been criticized for spectacle. And literary fiction talks about important issues, moralities, more thoughtful things. But this, I think, manages to do that. So it's a courtroom drama, and we have the fantastic, almost Dickensian caricatures of Rumpole himself, but also the old judge and also, the Dickensian figures, the father of the executed boy. And the other characteristic that makes it, for me, a good story is not just the characterization but also the themes, such as the issue of the death penalty. If you execute the wrong man, on the one hand, the liberal view is that you shouldn't do it because it's a mistake you can't correct. Rumpole is taking that position. However, the judge, and interestingly, the executed boy's father, now you could say as a side thought that he's been overwhelmed by the judge, who is his intellectual superior, and also a great rhetorician, has been persuaded by the judge's power of intellect and speech. The judge convinces him that, yes, it was okay. I know it was your son. But, hard cases make bad laws or something like that, which I actually don't understand. I've said it 3 times, but I don't know what it means. Somebody will tell me. So, Rumpole has this liberal view, no, you shouldn't do it because you can't make it right. And the judge has almost a more fatalistic perspective, focusing on the process rather than the individual. I think this perspective suggests that the execution of this man, ensuring that the law is upheld, is important for society, even if it occasionally leads to injustice. This is typically a conservative view. I think what happens, this is controversial, you see the Abu Ghraib prison thing, and there was a view that those crimes were justified. I think also with the Bloody Sunday incident. Shooting of Irish citizens, people just walking about. I think we're in a protest by the paratroopers. There are 2 views, one is it's a terrible thing, and the other is that it was justified by the situation, even if those individuals were innocent. And I think that's the key point, even if the individuals were innocent, the system requires lessons to be taught to keep things on the rails. And again, I'm not taking a position either way, I'm just saying that's an interesting thought that's brought up by this. The issue of the other related concept is the issue of the old man coming to the end of his career. He's been a total bastard, as they say, Rumpole thinks so anyway, and he is seeking some kind of absolution from his enemy. Rumpole. He is wanting to be forgiven. And what's really interesting is because he's a lawyer, there are the facts, whether the crime was done or not, and then the issues offered in mitigation. And so, the old man still defends this wrongful execution. It was wrong because the guy didn't do it, but not wrong in his eyes because it supported the system. You see what I'm saying? So the system was more important than the fate of the individual. I think I'm laboring that point. But then you give things in mitigation, Yeah, he did murder somebody, but he's kind to his mom, he's got a cat, he looks after this cat, and he helps the poor. And this guy shows you his. It's like a Blake Snyder save the cat moment where Blake Snyder's screenwriter always says, to make somebody lovable, a character lovable, get them to do something nice, like save a cat, and then the audience loves them. And so this is offered in mitigation like that. So the judge has wonderful roses, he cares about roses. He can care about something. We may say that's just kind of, caring about what color your bedroom's painted, because I'm not sure that we, afford roses the same privileges as we do a cat or a dog. We think, in some way, they perhaps are not as valuable, their lives are not as valuable as those of a creature that is more like us. And, of course, that's an interesting thing as well, creatures who are more similar to us get more value. So we tend to prefer mammals. We tend to prefer, mammals we know that are close to us, or cute mammals. And we're not so keen about slugs and worms and things like that. Or we like roses of all flowers, we give them a bit more, privilege than we do knapweed. But, we still think they're not as valuable as a cat. Yeah, you get me? So you get me, man. So there we are, the mitigation. And, of course, he's got grandchildren, and he is somebody who loves, he takes his photograph with him, loves his grandkids. That makes him capable of love and warmth. And, of course, there's this issue of him ordering muffins as if in celebration when he passes a death sentence. And he says that isn't true. And that's another mitigation fact as well, isn't it? I'm not the monster that I have appeared to be and the role I've enjoyed playing all these years. And now I'm looking death in the eye, so now I perhaps need to think about reparations. Is that a word in? That's appropriate in this case, yeah, I think so, for my badness. So fascinating issues, aren't they? But Rumpole doesn't buy it, and I keep coming to that Primo Levi story. So Primo Levi is an Italian communist who was a Jew who was, interned in the Nazi death camps in the Second World War and lived. He has a story called If This Is a Man, and he has this story: it's a really hot day, and the Nazis have packed the Jewish people into cattle carts. It's absolutely sweltering and, a very, very unpleasant situation. I mean, physically for anybody, never mind what they're going to, And, he has a picture of a German guard going to get some water for some of the prisoners. And what Primo Levi does is we would go to a save the cat moment. Oh, he's not such a bad bloke, that German guard, he doesn't really want to be involved in this, and we would absolve him somewhat, wouldn't we? Primo Levi doesn't do that. Primo Levi says, what kind of man is salving his conscience by giving water to a group of people he's consigning to a death camp? We will not forgive, because not for this. And so, I think in a smaller way, Rumpole's doing the same thing. He, we might, there's a picture of the roses, there's the grandchildren, there's the man who is persuaded, who's the actual father, who's forgiven him. And all these things might make us want to forgive Truscott, the judge. But Rumpole doesn't, because those do not make up for the enormity of his crimes in Rumpole's eyes. And so I think, fascinating story, really good, but as I said, if it offends anybody, copyrights and stuff like that, I've done it because I think it's really worthwhile having it done on the Classic Detective Stories podcast for the reasons I've enumerated or haven't enumerated I've described, and, but I will take it down if the copyright holder has the right to ask me to do it, which they will have, and, I'm kind of petering out now. Are it pathetically rum p would, and forgive me.